I saw a video that, among other things, talked about the value of educators in the Tekken community in this post-Discord hellscape of information sharing. Tekken is a very complicated game, and with more and more information buried in channels upon channels of obscure Discord servers, it's really difficult for a new player to find the kind of guidance they might need. A lot of how to improve at Tekken videos have been really similar in their approach to offering advice, and have mostly been targeting relative beginners, while there's very few resources on getting intermediate level players to start thinking about where to go next. Hopefully, I can give not just actionable advice, but also shed some light on the intuition behind how the game works on a fundamental level. Intermediate level Tekken is where a lot of people have a solid understanding of their own character, but not necessarily a lot of other characters, or movement and defense, or risk and reward, etc. This means these players will often gravitate towards overly aggressive plays, since shutting down the opponent completely is way easier than dealing with their offense. If you're used to that kind of Tekken, other players' offense will seem oppressive, overwhelming, and unfair. So let's go through some things you can do to deal with that approach and hopefully improve your understanding of the game. Every move in Tekken has strengths and weaknesses. The weaknesses can be more or less pronounced depending on the move and the character, but there's usually something you can take advantage of. I feel like when learning Tekken, it's important to always keep that in mind and consciously look out for these weaknesses and gradually build up intuition. Instead of blaming your opponent for being toxic and spammy, try to figure out ways to use their own moves against them. The easiest thing you can do that will get you immediate results right now is ducking highs. More specifically, highs that are follow-ups and strings. Highs carry innate risk in that they can be ducked and launched. To give you some perspective, that's more risky than a blocked hopkick. To offset the risk, these highs are often otherwise really strong and even overpowered. This is a problem for intermediate players who are very focused on their own gameplay and actions, and really forget to check their opponents for their mistakes. If you never punish your opponent for taking these risks, you're left dealing with overwhelmingly powerful tools. So please duck the highs. Please duck them. Here are some different kinds of highs you can look out for. This will greatly improve your win rate, as it not only gives you an immediate reward in the form of damage, but also it forces your opponent to immediately start thinking about the moves they should be using instead. Now they're not just thinking about how to beat you, they're also thinking about finding a replacement to their old strategy. Their attention is divided, and your own offense is made more effective as a result. You're also bypassing the annoying spammy bits of Tekken I'm sure you hate, and you can get to a level where you can finally develop and challenge your fundamental play. And on top of all that, this teaches you to pay attention to your opponent's moves and habits, something that will be invaluable to you in the future. Of course, ducking highs is not the only way you can achieve this kind of result, but it's the easiest one you could start doing today if you wanted. It might not seem like this at first, but Tekken is internally very consistent with the kinds of strengths and weaknesses that a move can have, and over time you can build up intuition for the rules the moves are following. I'm linking my guide on this subject in the description. Building up intuition for that sort of stuff takes a lot of time, so I wrote the guide that I wish existed when I was starting out with a game. Interactions in Tekken are notably slower than other games you might be familiar with. In Street Fighter V, a jab has a total duration of around 14 frames, but in Tekken that shoots up to around 25 frames. That's almost as slow as Lost Dragon Tail, a move you're meant to be able to react to. And it only gets slower from there since jabs are, barring a few exceptions, the fastest moves in the game. For instance, down forward ones, a staple poke for almost every character, have a total duration of around 35 frames. well past half a second and very comfortably within what you can react to. Tekken is designed this way so that when you block or get hit by a move, by the time the interaction ends, you have had enough time to process what the opponent did and understand the situation you're currently in. Tekken is also designed this way so that all the high-string follow-ups that are giving you trouble are 100% reactable and always carry some risk to the opponent. It requires concentration, but it's possible. And even just realizing that can give you the confidence boost you might need to try reacting to them. Don't be confused though. Half a second or so is not always enough for you to make informed decisions on the fly. Your responses in these kinds of situations will often be based on decisions you've made beforehand. Hopefully, you're already thinking about how you yourself can avoid giving your opponent easy openings they can exploit, so let's talk about risk and reward a bit more. When people talk about playing solid and fundamentals, what they're talking about is adopting a stable strategy instead of a volatile one where your chances of success are many times higher than the chances of failure, even if your reward suffers a bit as a result. Remember, you're not just trying to win one game, you're trying to win significantly more games than you lose, and you're trying to improve as a player. Tekken as a game rewards strong defense. Blows are practically the only way to damage a defensive opponent, and their risk is generally higher than the reward. A hell sweep will do decent damage and set up for good Okizeme, but getting that hell sweep block will result in the loss of half your life bar. If you look at high-level play, you'll generally see a lot of fast safe pokes and relatively safe lows, with a lot of the hard-hitting moves players tend to gravitate towards almost nowhere to be seen. That's not to say you shouldn't take risks ever. If you never ever go for a hell sweep, there's no reason for your opponent to fear it, and you will never land your high damage mids because your opponent doesn't have a good reason to start blocking low. You can win entire games on risky options alone, but it's often better to use them as a conditioning tool to make your safer moves that much more effective. This is part of a more general subject called conditioning that I won't really be talking about in this video, but I will link some resources in the description. You might be wondering, why would anyone ever use highs if they're as dangerous as they make them out to be? Well, often enough, the most useful highs are single moves that require a read to duck. They're still very strong, but getting them punished is more of a matter of you being predictable with them or telegraphing them too much. The purpose of string follow-up highs is often quite different, so let's check out a few cases. A common use case is highs as a way to attach extra risk to a tool. Heihachi's and Pulse Spike 1-2 are really strong homing tools, and the second hit is there to allow your opponent to react to your mistakes without compromising on the fast startup speed. The other common use case is, of course, to deter mashing or punishment, or as a risky option that puts yourself in a good position. Kazuya's down forward 1-4 is one of the few ways you can get decent frame advantage from poking. At least his down forward 1+2 will launch you if you try to punish the string too early. Sometimes you even have mid alternatives as a mix-up to stop your opponent from ducking. This at first might seem like the basis of a decent endgame, but if you analyze the situation a bit more closely, you can kinda see that in most cases, this kind of mix-up will not be in your favor. In most cases, even if you're successful, you're left at either a disadvantage or without significant advantage. To add to this is a very common design pattern in Tekken, where some string starters are given worse properties than they should have, just to make the player take risks through follow-ups. At least his down 4 is kinda terrible on its own, and it stops your momentum. Kazuya's down forward 1 is unusable as a poke. Heihachi's back 1 is terrible even on hit. This is why you will basically never see mix-up of this kind applied on a large scale at a high-level play. Going back to the risk versus reward topic, it's an element of a volatile strategy. Your mistakes are punished much harder than your successes reward you, and you're overall going to put yourself in unfavorable situations. High-level Tekken revolves around fast pokes like jabs, down forward ones, down forward fours, etc. And that's for a few good reasons. The easiest to understand is that if two players do a move at the same time, the one that comes out the fastest will win. But another way to think of it is, if you're trying to poke me with a 20-frame move and I'm trying to poke you with a 10-frame move, I have a 9-frame margin of error to predict your timing and counter hit you. Obviously, this is an oversimplified way to look at interaction in neutral, but any advantage here will add to the stability of your strategy. Another thing that intermediate players might not necessarily be thinking about as much as they should is the concept of commitment. You might look at Brian's back one and see that it's a big plus for mid, and hey, that's pretty cool. But something you might not think about is that this move has a total duration of 56 frames, with a 20-frame startup. When you press back one, you're giving away control of your character for almost an entire second, in hopes that you will hit someone a third of a second later. Moves like that are not only easy to interrupt like I mentioned before, but also they leave you vulnerable for a really long time if your opponent has an answer for them. For instance, if you're finding yourself frustrated by power crushes, you might be relying on high commitment moves a bit too much. You're in general giving the opponent more time to respond with their defensive options. This is why single jabs are one of the best keep-out tools in the game. They come out and recover really fast and are amazing at shutting down a lot of options due to their sheer speed. In other words, they have very low commitment and a very high margin of error to interrupt your opponent, and actually reward you a lot more than you might think at first. By interrupting your opponent's approach like that, you're not only putting yourself at a great position offensively with frame advantage, but you're also, again, forcing your opponent to rethink their game plan. Even if they block, you're now +1, and in a really good situation to start your own offense. If you find yourself getting overwhelmed by a lot of slower moves, you should start thinking about whether you're respecting your opponent too much and giving them too much space. Neutral is in general a time where both players have access to a lot of tools and options, and that can seem overwhelming at first. Fast pokes are one of the ways you can shut down a lot of them while remaining relatively safe. Neutral is not the only situation where fast moves are amazing, but in order to get into that, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. The importance of frame data is often overstated, and it's usually presented as a thing you should just memorize to tell what's safe, what you can punish, when you can sidestep, etc. This tends to get a pretty bad reaction from some players, since, I mean, they're here to play Tekken, not Spreadsheet Fighter 7. I feel like it's better to teach players how to think about frame data and how to use it to figure out things on their own. To my experience, this is much more rewarding than just giving them a list of numbers and asking them to know it. So at its core, frame data is a tool you can use to analyze and get some perspective on all kinds of situations. Through simple addition and subtraction, you can quickly get an idea of how likely something is to work and what kind of effect it will have on the match. You can use it to see if you're giving your opponent too much space and if there's something you can do to throw them off. All of this is something you can just figure out by playing the game, and there's a few top players that do just that and don't really think about the numbers. But knowing the numbers helps speed up your intuition. So let's work with an example. Without going too much into every available option, let's use frame data to analyze what happens after your opponent blocks your hypothetical down forward 1. You are now at -3. Your fastest high option is 10 frames, your fastest mid option is 13 frames. From this situation, your jab will trade if they do an I-13 move, and your down forward 1 will trade at their I-16. Here's the situation from your opponent's perspective. Every move that's slower than I-16 is now too slow for the situation because of your down forward 1. Every move that doesn't high crash between I-13 and I-16 carries some risk because of your jab. Every move between I-10 and I-12 will interrupt all of your offense but will lose to sidestep or ducking. Their movement might evade your offense but might also give you the opportunity to create a bigger advantage for yourself. So just by making your opponent block your move, you've attached almost certain risk to a significant portion of their moveset, and some risk to most of the rest. Actually, if we add your magic for at I-11 to the equation, every non-high crush move after I-14 now carries the risk of getting launched. That's not to say that the risk-reward is necessarily in your favor. You're still, after all, recovering slower than they are. But the opponent's options are still very limited compared to what they could do before. It greatly simplifies the amount of scenarios you have to think about. Your opponent can just do nothing, or use their movement, or they could be using moves that belong here or here or here. This has effectively boiled down a seemingly complicated interaction into a handful of distinct scenarios. You are greatly rewarded for observing your opponent and picking up on their habits under pressure, and you can really make it hurt once you figure them out. It's important to note that this kind of analysis doesn't always give you the full picture, as crushing, sidestepping, and backdashing, and even specific matchups complicate the interaction, but it should give you an idea of whether your opponent is overstepping their bounds, and what options of yours are likely to succeed based on their habits. More often than not, the mix-up or power mid your opponent will want to throw out is going to be extremely interruptible. I hope this has been helpful to you in some way. I really wanted to talk more about the reasoning behind why higher level Tekken is the way it is, and ways you could think about your own play to help you get there. As mentioned before, I will be linking some useful resources in the description if you want to check that out. Thank you so much for watching. See ya!